There are stories in the Bible that most people have never heard from a pulpit, stories that were not removed from Scripture, because they could not be removed. They are there, written in full, preserved through thousands of years, carried through every translation, surviving every council and every generation of readers who chose to look away. This is one of those stories. It does not appear in children's Bible lessons. It is rarely discussed in Sunday school. And when it is mentioned at all, it is mentioned briefly, with lowered eyes and careful words, as though the act of speaking it too clearly might somehow make it worse. But it is in the Bible. It is in Genesis. It is part of the same sacred account that contains the creation of the world, the calling of Abraham, and the covenant that would one day bring forth the people of Israel. To understand what happened to Lot's daughters, to truly understand it, we must go back to the beginning of their story, not to the cave, not to the night that changed everything. We must go back to a city that had already sealed its own destruction, and to a family that survived it. We must go back to Sodom. In the ancient world, the cities of the plain, Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar, stood near what scholars believe to have been the southern region of the Jordan Valley, in a land that Genesis describes as well-watered and fertile, like the garden of the Lord, before its devastation. These were prosperous cities. They commanded trade routes. They accumulated wealth. And within their walls, the biblical account is unambiguous. Their sin was exceedingly grave. Genesis 13:13 does not hesitate. The men of Sodom, it says, were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. The Hebrew word used, meod, is the same intensifying word used elsewhere in Scripture to communicate the utmost degree of something, not merely sinful, exceedingly so. The Lord himself speaks of it in Genesis 18, when he appears to Abraham near the oaks of Mamre. 3 visitors come to Abraham, and the Lord reveals his intention. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah has become great. Their sin is exceedingly grave. He will go down and see whether what has been done there is as bad as the outcry that has reached him. Abraham, standing before the Lord, begins to intercede. It is one of the most remarkable dialogues in all of Scripture, a man bargaining with God, not out of arrogance, but out of profound reverence and love for the possibility of righteous people who might still live within those walls. "Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" Abraham asks. And the Lord, in his patience, agrees. If 50 righteous men are found, the city will be spared. If 45, if 40, if 30, if 20, if 10. 10 righteous people. The answer, as history would confirm, was that not even 10 could be found. Lot had gone to Sodom. He had chosen it when Abraham gave him the choice of the land. He had looked at the well-watered plain and had pitched his tent toward Sodom, and over time he had moved inside its gates. He had become a man of the city. He sat in its gate, which in ancient Near Eastern culture was not merely a place of passage, but a place of civic authority, a location where the elders of a city gathered to conduct legal matters and receive visitors. Lot was not an outsider looking in. He was embedded in Sodom's life. He had a wife. He had daughters, and those daughters were promised to men of the city, men who were sons-in-law, or at the very least pledged to be so, woven into the social fabric of Sodom itself. 2 angels arrived in Sodom at evening. Lot saw them and rose to meet them, bowing with his face to the ground. He pressed them strongly to come to his house, to wash their feet, to eat, to rest, before continuing their journey. The Hebrew verb used, vayiptzar, conveys insistence, urgency, the pressing of a host who knows something of the danger in those streets that his guests do not yet know. The angels initially refused. They said they would spend the night in the square, but Lot pressed them again. and they came into his house. What happened next is recorded without embellishment in Genesis 19. Before they had even lain down, the men of Sodom, all of them, from every part of the city, both young and old, surrounded the house and called out to Lot. They demanded that he bring the men outside so that they could abuse them. The Hebrew text uses the word yada, the same word used in Genesis 4 when Adam knew his wife, carrying the full weight of its meaning in this context. What the men of Sodom intended was not fellowship or questioning. It was violent assault against strangers under a man's roof, a violation of the most sacred law of ancient Near Eastern hospitality. Lot went outside and shut the door behind him. He pleaded with the men of Sodom. He called them brothers. He begged them not to act wickedly. And then Lot made an offer that has troubled readers of this text for millennia. He offered his daughters. He said he had 2 daughters who had never known a man. He offered them to the crowd instead. "Do with them as you please," he said. "Only do nothing to these men who have come under the shelter of my roof." This moment in the text is one of the most difficult in all of Scripture. Commentators across traditions have wrestled with it for centuries. Some see in Lot's words a desperate act of hospitality taken to a horrifying extreme, the protection of guests under his roof being, in that ancient cultural framework, a sacred obligation that superseded even his duty to his own children. Others see in it the spiritual compromise that had already quietly overtaken Lot during his years in Sodom, a man who had absorbed the values of a city that treated people as property. What the text does not do is praise Lot for this offer. It records it. It lets it stand in all its moral complexity, the way Scripture so often does, not sanitizing the actions of its characters, not turning them into flawless heroes, but presenting human beings as they truly are, in their fear and their failure and their incomplete virtue. The men of Sodom refused Lot's offer and pressed toward him, nearly breaking down the door. The angels reached out and pulled Lot back inside and struck the men at the door with blindness, a blindness so total and so disorienting that even then, even blinded, the men of Sodom wore themselves out trying to find the door. The angels told Lot everything. Anyone he had in the city, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, anyone, must leave now. The outcry before the Lord against this place had grown so great that the Lord had sent them to destroy it. Lot went to his sons-in-law, the men pledged to marry his daughters, and told them to flee. Genesis records their response with devastating simplicity. He seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. They did not believe him. They stayed. As morning approached, the angels urged Lot with increasing urgency, "Arise. Take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." Lot hesitated. He lingered. The Hebrew says he delayed, mitmachma, as though some part of him could not fully release what he had built in that city, even knowing what it was. The angels seized his hand and the hands of his wife and his 2 daughters. The Lord was merciful to him. They brought them outside and told them to flee to the hills and not look back, not stop anywhere in the valley. Lot pleaded for mercy to stop at a nearby small city, and the Lord granted it. That city was called Zoar. They reached it just as the sun rose over the land. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. He overthrew those cities and all the valley, and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. The destruction was absolute. The landscape itself was transformed. What had once been compared to the garden of the Lord became, in the space of a morning, a place of ash and ruin. Lot's wife looked back. She became a pillar of salt. The exact nature of what this means has been discussed across centuries of theological inquiry. The command had been given clearly. Do not look back. Do not stop. Her turning back is understood in rabbinic tradition and in later Christian reflection as more than physical disobedience. It was a turning of the heart, a failure to fully release what was being left behind. Jesus himself would later invoke her memory in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 17, warning his disciples about the danger of clinging to what must be left. "Remember Lot's wife," he said. A warning compressed into 3 words. She is gone. She is a pillar. And Lot continues into Zoar, with only his 2 daughters beside him. Abraham, far away at his place on the heights, rose early that morning and looked out toward Sodom and Gomorrah and all the land of the valley. He saw the smoke rising from the land like the smoke of a furnace. He had interceded. He had bargained down to 10. There were not even 10, but God remembered Abraham, and so Lot was brought out. Now Lot and his 2 daughters were in Zoar, but fear overtook them there too. Lot was afraid to remain in Zoar, and so he went up from Zoar and settled in the hills with his 2 daughters, because he was afraid. And they lived in a cave, he and his 2 daughters. This is where the second part of this story begins. The world as Lot's daughters knew it was gone. Let that settle in for a moment. These were young women. The text does not give us their names, which is itself a kind of silencing that Scripture sometimes imposes on its female characters, and which later traditions have attempted to fill with names like Phine and Thama in some ancient sources, though these names appear nowhere in the canonical text. They had grown up in a city. They had been promised to men. Their mother was dead, transformed into a pillar of salt behind them on the road, in a moment of finality so sudden and so strange that grief itself may not have had time to properly form. Their future husbands had stayed in Sodom and had perished with it. Everything was gone. The land below them, the land they could see from the mouth of their cave, was destroyed. The cities of the plain, the only civilization they had known, no longer existed. Their social world, their community, their relationships, their future as they had imagined it, all of it reduced to ash and smoke. And their father, the man who had offered them to a mob, the man who had hesitated at the city gate when the angels urged him to flee, the man who had lingered even as judgment fell. This man was their only family, their only connection to another human being on earth, as far as their immediate experience told them. The older daughter spoke to the younger daughter. Her words are recorded in Genesis 19:31-32. She said, "Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth." There is a reading of this line that has sometimes been offered, that the daughters somehow believed the entire world had been destroyed, not just the cities of the plain, and that their thinking was shaped by a genuine, if mistaken, belief that they were the last people on earth. This interpretation attempts to account for the extreme nature of what they were about to do. Whether this was their actual belief, or whether it simply reflects their total psychological isolation in that moment, the text does not resolve completely. What the text does record is the decision they made. The older daughter proposed that they give their father wine to drink and then lie with him, that they might preserve offspring through their father. They did so on 2 successive nights. Genesis 19:33 states that Lot did not know when the older daughter lay down or when she rose. Genesis 19:35 repeats the same language about the younger daughter. The text is careful and deliberate in its use of this phrase, repeated twice, once for each daughter, communicating that Lot was not a knowing, willing participant in what occurred. Both daughters became pregnant. The older daughter bore a son and called him Moab. He is identified as the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger daughter bore a son and called him Ben-Ami. He is identified as the father of the Ammonites to this day. These are not minor footnotes in biblical history. The Moabites and the Ammonites would be two of the most significant neighboring peoples to ancient Israel across centuries of its existence. The Book of Numbers records Israel's encounters with Moab. The Book of Deuteronomy carries laws concerning the Ammonites. The Book of Ruth, which contains perhaps the most beloved portrait of faithfulness in all of the Hebrew Scriptures, centers on a Moabite woman named Ruth, who would attach herself to her Israelite mother-in-law Naomi with words that have echoed across every generation since. "Where you go, I will go. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried." Ruth the Moabite would marry Boaz. They would have a son named Obed. Obed would have a son named Jesse. Jesse would have a son named David, the greatest king in Israel's history, the man whose throne God promised would endure forever. The line from that cave to David runs through Ruth. The line from that cave to David runs through a Moabite woman, descended from the son born of that desperate, broken night in the hills above a ruined valley. And the line from David, according to the Gospel of Matthew chapter 1, runs to Jesus of Nazareth. Scripture does not hide this. Matthew's genealogy, which opens the New Testament, includes 4 women in a list of ancestors: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Their inclusion is deliberate. Each of their stories contains shadows. Each of them was touched by circumstances that polite society preferred not to examine. And yet each of them is named in the line through which the Messiah came. Ruth is there, the Moabite, the daughter of Moab, the descendant of a night in a cave that the world has never known quite how to speak about. This is one of the places where the Bible refuses to allow simplicity. If you have not yet subscribed to Untold Scripture, this is the moment. Every week we go into the passages that most channels avoid, the stories that are fully in the Bible but rarely make it into a sermon, the texts that carry uncomfortable truths and impossible questions. Subscribe now so you never miss an episode, because this is exactly the kind of content this channel was built for. Now, let us consider what the theological tradition has made of this story across the centuries, because the responses are as revealing as the story itself. In the ancient Jewish Midrashic tradition, the daughters are sometimes treated with a degree of understanding that might surprise modern readers. The rabbis who composed the Midrash Rabbah examined the text with characteristic precision and asked the same difficult questions that readers have always asked. They noted that the older daughter is mentioned first and acts first, and concluded that she bore greater moral weight for initiating what occurred. But they also wrestled with the context. The daughters had witnessed the destruction of everything. They had lost their intended husbands. They were in isolation. The sages did not excuse what happened, but they did not flatten it into simple condemnation either. The Jewish scholar Nachmanides, writing in the 13th century, observed that the daughter's intention was not selfish or corrupt in the way that most sexual sin is characterized in Scripture. They were not seeking pleasure. They were not seeking to undermine a relationship or violate a covenant. In their understanding, however mistaken, they were attempting to preserve human life, to continue a family line. The means were profoundly wrong. The intention, he argued, was not without its tragic logic. Early Christian commentators approached the passage differently. Some allegorized it in ways that modern readers find strained, seeing in the 2 daughters symbols of the Jewish people and the Gentile nations, each drawing from a failing father figure. Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century engaged with the text as a moral warning about what isolation and despair can produce when human beings are cut off from proper community and divine guidance. What nearly all of these interpretive traditions share is a refusal to simply look away. The text is there. The questions are real, and the answers are not simple. There is something important in the fact that Genesis does not moralize at the end of this account. There is no verse that says, "And God was displeased." There is no divine punishment issued. There is no thunderclap. The story ends with the naming of two sons and the identification of two peoples who would emerge from them. This silence has been interpreted in different ways. Some see it as a kind of mercy, the text leaving space for the daughter's desperation, acknowledging that judgment belongs to God alone. Others see it as a deliberate literary choice, the consequences themselves being the moral, the origins of two historically troubled peoples being their own commentary on the brokenness of the night that created them. But there is another silence in this text that must be named. It is the silence around what Lot's daughters had already endured before the cave. They had been offered by their own father to a violent crowd. They had been placed in that moment as objects to be given, rather than people to be protected. The text does not record their response to that offer. We do not know how they heard it. We do not know what they felt standing behind that door while their father's voice carried through the wood. We do not know what it meant to them to have survived Sodom, to have fled with a father who had made that offer, to have watched their mother die on the road, to have arrived at a cave on a hillside with nothing left. The Bible does not give us their interior lives in the way a modern novel would. But Scripture is honest enough to record the circumstances that shaped them. And those circumstances were catastrophic in ways that extended far beyond the physical destruction of the cities. These were women who had experienced layers of loss and violation before the night in the cave. The reader who encounters their story with this in mind encounters something different than the reader who encounters it as a simple moral scandal. This does not excuse their actions. Scripture does not excuse them, but Scripture does contextual them. And context, theological, historical, human, is not the same as excuse. The older daughter's name is never given. The younger daughter's name is never given. And yet their sons' names, Moab and Ben-Ami, are recorded precisely because those names carried national significance. The women were defined in the biblical record by what came from them, not by who they were. This is a pattern that appears elsewhere in Scripture and has been the subject of significant scholarly reflection in the last several decades, the naming of men and the silence around women, even women whose actions shaped the trajectory of nations. What can be said with confidence, within the bounds of the text, is that Moab and Ben-Ami became real peoples. They occupied real land. They interacted with Israel across centuries of biblical history. And through one of them, through the Moabite line, through Ruth, through a faithfulness that overcame the shadows of origin, a thread ran directly into the genealogy of Israel's greatest king, and in the testimony of the New Testament, into the ancestry of Jesus of Nazareth. The theologian Karl Barth, in his massive work on the doctrine of reconciliation, wrote about the way God works not in spite of human failure, but through it, not endorsing the failure, never endorsing it, but sovereign over it in ways that human calculations cannot anticipate or constrain. The stories of Scripture are filled with this pattern. Jacob deceived his father. David committed adultery and arranged murder. Rahab was a prostitute who hid spies and was grafted into the covenant. Tamar dressed as a prostitute to secure the justice she was owed and ended up in the lineage of kings. The Bible's genealogies are not records of moral achievement. They are records of divine persistence through human failure, generation after generation, across centuries of broken, complicated, desperate human lives. Lot's daughters are part of that record. They are not heroes of faith in the way Abraham is, or Moses, or Ruth herself. They are not presented as models to be followed. They are presented as human beings, frightened, isolated, shaped by catastrophe, making choices in darkness that had consequences reaching far beyond anything they could have imagined in that cave on that hillside above the ruins of the world they had lost. And God, the God who remembered Abraham, the God who was merciful even to Lot, the God who would one day say that he makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, that God did not abandon the story. He did not erase its consequences, but he did not abandon it. The Moabites and the Ammonites would have complex, often adversarial relationships with Israel. The law of Deuteronomy, chapter 23, states that no Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation, a verse that exists alongside the story of Ruth, creating one of the many places in Scripture where law and narrative exist in productive tension, each illuminating what the other cannot say alone. Ruth's story is often read as a story of personal faithfulness and love. And it is that. But it is also a story of the 10th generation and beyond, of a Moabite woman whose faithfulness overcame the shadow of her national origin, who was received into the community of Israel, who was celebrated by the community of Bethlehem, and who was woven by the sovereign design of God into the lineage through which the promised Messiah would come. That Messiah would himself be found in places no one expected. Born in a stable, raised in Galilee, which the prophets had called Galilee of the Gentiles, a place of shadow, a place of mixed peoples and uncertain origins. His ancestry, traced in Matthew's genealogy, included women whose stories contained exactly the kind of shadows that polite religious tradition preferred to leave unnamed. The story of Lot's daughters ends in a cave, but it does not end there. There is a way of reading the Bible that seeks only the inspiring, the triumphant, the morally straightforward. That reading will always skip these chapters. It will smooth over the passages that create discomfort, resolve the tensions too quickly, and present a version of Scripture that is cleaner and simpler than what the text actually contains. But the Bible was not written to be comfortable. It was written to be true. And the truth it tells about human beings is not that they are noble and righteous when given the chance. The truth it tells again and again in the stories of Abraham and Jacob and David and Peter, in the stories of Lot and his daughters and Rahab and Tamar, the truth it tells is that human beings are fractured, desperate, capable of terrible choices in moments of fear and isolation, and yet somehow held within a story that is larger than their worst nights. The story of Lot's daughters is a story of catastrophe and survival and moral failure and unexpected consequence. It is also, when read fully and within the whole arc of Scripture, a story of how the line of the promise moved through impossible places, through ash and ruin, through a cave on a hillside, through a Moabite widow in a barley field in Bethlehem, and arrived exactly where it was always going. That is not an excuse for what happened. It is something more difficult and more profound than an excuse. It is the testimony of a God who does not require perfect instruments to write a perfect story. If this episode opened a part of Scripture you had never encountered before, or gave language to something you had read but never known how to hold, then Untold Scripture is the channel you have been looking for. Every week we go deeper into the texts that the rest of the religious world leaves behind, the stories that are fully biblical, fully sacred, and fully unspoken. Subscribe to Untold Scripture right now and join a community of people who believe that the whole Bible deserves to be read, not just the comfortable parts. We will be here every week, going further in. The daughters of Lot have no monuments. Their names were never recorded. The cave where they sheltered has no marker. But the world they helped bring into existence, the peoples, the nations, the complicated chain of ancestry that runs from a hillside above Sodom to a manger in Bethlehem, that world is still with us, And the God who held that story together through all its darkness and all its failure is still the same God. That is the word Scripture leaves us with. Not comfort, not easy resolution, not the erasure of what was difficult, but the unshakable testimony that the story is held, that even the nights we cannot speak about in polite company are known and named and somehow, impossibly, included in the longest story ever told.